Здравейте, драги зрители! In the digging process of doing research, the novel dedicated to the perspective of the Lord of Night, Konrad Curze, The Night Haunter, by Guy Haley, crept upon me. Here's where I have to come clean. I learned of this book when it came out, and a particular detail about it made me not want to read it at all. It mainly boiled down to a preconceived notion I had about the titular character. Surprisingly enough, nothing related to mere memes, only old lore absorbed through second-hand sources that existed before the book's actual release. What the Primarch novels are meant to do is offer a glimpse into the perspective and nature of the respective sons of the Emperor with a greater degree of depth, which on its own is an excellent endeavor. Beings as enigmatic and supreme over a setting's narrative as the Fathers of the Legions most certainly deserve such a treatment. To provide some meaty sustenance to their fans, open doors for new ones to develop, and expand their existing lore. Where my objection laid, in regards to the book, was in the manner in which the character was expanded. But I must be thorough in my research, and it was an important component to a future video, so I did my due diligence. The result of which, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Firstly, let's go over the contents of its pages and the revelations found within. Those among you, brimming with fear about them, may consider this as the advanced warning about spoilers. Very quickly before we jump into the story, I would really appreciate it if you eviscerated the like button and subscribed for future videos. Now, let us enter the shadows of the... Rather than a linear tale, the book is instead a confessional of Konrad to the macabre statue of the Emperor he had personally built out of the mutilated flesh and bone of slaves captured by the 8th Legion, displaying the manic state Curze had reached as he goes between philosophical, commenting on how one needs to be strong in front of their sons, but can be weak when they are the son in front of their father, in relation to his legion going stir-crazy from his command to not impede his assassination, comedy bleeding into regret as he clasped his hands before the grotesque idol and uttered in jest, "Forgive me, father, for I have sinned," followed by, "Sanguinius believed you might," in reference to the very likely forgiveness he would receive, and capped off with a variety of angry, confused, and broken outbursts, accusations, and physical recoiling. Over the course of the confession, Konrad takes us through several segments of his life depicted in key moments. Some that he believed important to share, and some that simply leaked out of his deteriorating mind. From back in his days as Night Haunter, within the shadows of Nostramo, he first recalls appearing in the home of a woman who had lost her husband and elected to... keep herself safe. He would torture her to death, as what she wanted to do was a crime in his eyes. And when her bafflement at that came out, the monster explained that taking her own life would deteriorate society around them even further, which was something he could not allow. Next in this period, he recalled coming upon 2 men in the process of committing a heinous act upon a woman. He killed the first, and allowed the second to run for the sport of it. At the last moment of hope, the monster swiped the fleeing scoundrel and toyed with him for a brief while, before he was beset by one of the many visions of the future, induced within him at the cost of crippling pain. It showed him 2 possibilities. In the first, he would adopt the young man that he had now snatched as his first disciple, from whom he would eventually grow a movement of reformed people that could actually bring justice and order to Nostramo in a brighter fashion than what he was doing. In the second, the young man would wound him and escape his clutches, diminishing the fear of the Night Haunter and rising to be a bloody murderous tyrant, the one who got away from the monster, who would bring about the death of countless people before Konrad could finally get to him and put him down. Rather than risking the implied failure, he would instead kill the man, even though if he had simply looked around, he would see that he had no means by which to realize the darker future Curze had seen. Afterwards, the Primarch deemed it pertinent to inform the abominable effigy he had crafted how exactly he had returned to where they now resided, the Night Lords' fortress upon the world of Tsagulsa, roughly 30 years after Sanguinius entombed his brother in a stasis pod, which he then threw out into the void of space. A random scavenger vessel would pick up the abandoned sarcophagus in the hopes of it being something profitable, a mistake they would pay dearly for, as the horror locked within managed to escape, slaughtering every person on board, save for one. an undiscovered young psyker who helped fly the ship turned abattoir towards the carrion world that became the Eighth's new home, and who was both tortured and taken care of by Curze during the trek, as the Night Haunter fell to moments of savage boredom. The last recollections were moments depicting the degradation of Konrad's Legion, infested with poor recruits, injected into the Night Lord's bloodstream by rotten apples among them, such as one Gendor Scrivok, who has kept his loyalty to his ancient criminal family and his own interest over Curze and the Legion, as well as said criminal families returning to prominence back on the Eighth's original homeworld of Nostramo, after the monster that had kept them in check left the planet, overthrowing the sitting government appointed by the Primarch, all of which led to the destruction of the Night World at the hands of the Midnight Clad themselves. Out of nowhere, the Flesh Monument spoke back, refuting his maligned son's accusations, pointing out his inadequacies, lamenting not being able to help him cure them, and, regardless of whether it wanted it, forgave the boy lost in the shadows. Ending its speech as abruptly as it had begun, left Konrad, whose mind was now at the precipice of imploding, to wonder whether his father, the Emperor, had actually spoken to him, or if this was simply another delusion. Enraged, the Lord of Night would rip apart his creation, before finally breaking down. Upon composing himself, he quietly proceeded to his throne room, where destiny awaited him, except this time he chose it to take place, as the last act he would actually take of his own volition, ending the story with his final words to the assassin sent after him, which he used at the book's very beginning. "Your presence does not surprise me, assassin. I have known of you ever since your craft entered the eastern fringes. Why did I not have you killed? Because your mission and the act you are about to commit proves the truth of all I have ever said or done. I merely punished those who had wronged, just as your false emperor now seeks to punish me. Death is nothing compared to vindication." To climb out of the darkness, you must first dive into it. Hence why I'll begin with the big gripe I have with this tome: the assassination of the character, Konrad Curze, in favor of the character Night Haunter. Konrad, you're really not beating the evil space Batman allegations, man. Because this maps out almost perfectly to the who's the real character, Bruce Wayne or Batman debate. And to clarify that, a brief look back in history is needed. When I first started delving into the lore of 40k, Curze grew into the position of being my second most favorite Primarch from a combination of two factors. First being the underdog tragedy that was his descent into madness, treason, and ultimately doom. The second is what I believe this book has broken. Before this Primarch novel's release, as far as I had understood his lore, Konrad, the Bruce, was the core. He did monstrous things, but only out of necessity, or when the visions overtook him and sent him into a frenzied rampage without his conscious control. That, under the duress of said visions, which were highly implied to be originally induced and subsequently influenced by chaos, to have the canon timeline feel correct to him. Along with actually doubting and analyzing himself, over time he realized he was slipping far into being a genuine monster, a criminal, which is what finally broke him, pushing him to destroy his homeworld as punishment for the treason he had uncovered there, as well as lashing out in anger, but not while under a vision's control, and to go along with fate. Yet, in this novel, that image is practically erased, beginning from this segment. Curze grinned. "You do not wish to die any longer. I can tell. That is unfortunate, but it must be done." He advanced on her. "Feel joy that your death will bring justice to this world. Feel joy that I bring order." He cut again. This time she screamed. A droplet of warm, wet red dotted his cheek. He fought the urge to lick it off. He must be sober and serious. "I assure you, I do not enjoy this at all." His heart quickened at the lie. From this moment on, it began going south for me, as Night Haunter was made to be the character's core. As a fan of his, I am more than fine with acknowledging that Curze, as a character, is weak. However, as far as I had understood it until reading this story, His weakness came from all of the self-doubt and internal conflict from trying to square his desire for justice and the monstrous actions he was taking. His weakness came from his own agency, because he did not believe himself strong enough to oppose fate and cleanse the growing taint of his legion. Not because he was already afflicted with that very same taint himself. In these pages, he is shown exhibiting practically all of the poison faults that led to the Eighth's degeneration, like brutalizing and torturing for fun, rather than when lost under a vision's influence, which just turns his supposed convictions of justice, the backbone of his agency as a likable character, into mere hypocrisy, making his actions misguided, like the Exterminatus of Nostramo, being changed to instead be a punishment for his legion rather than the world itself, the intent of which was to, quote-unquote, scare the poisonous and falteringly degenerate, newly inducted elements of the Night Lords back in proper line. Except said intention failed spectacularly, because all of those abysmally subadequate scum couldn't give a rat's ass about a home that made their lives hell, then fed them to the monsters in the dark just to be rid of them. Adding to which was the tragedy that the only thing the Night World's burning achieved was to decimate the already diminished numbers of the actually capable and more noble ranks of both the Astartes and the fleet crew, who openly objected to the act and were culled for it by Sevatar and his Atramentar per Night Haunter's orders. And as a cherry on top, strengthening the hypocrisy, throughout the book, the Primarch is made to seem far more sure and confident in his actions and decisions, with only scant and frankly very poor shows of self-doubt, with basically no introspection. It stung me in particular when at the end of a vision, in which he had already turned traitor and butchered for Horus's cause, he screamed, "I will not become that creature!" Because by then I couldn't think of anything other than, "You've already been this creature since before the Emperor found you," as a reaction to it. I will again concede that it is very likely that the version of Konrad I believe to have understood from the absorbed lore prior to the book can be wrong. That everything written down in the novel's pages is perfectly up to snuff with all of the surrounding setup, and that I am being upset by having a mistake of perception clarified. But from going over things again, I've only strengthened my conviction on the matter, and am just left to see that a good character being murdered in favor of a disgustingly inferior one. At this point, I feel the urge to clarify that my discontent is directed specifically at the trajectory this strand of narrative is being taken towards, not the actual writing itself. Initially, the jumping between various scenes felt kind of disjointed, but as the book went on and the realization that the reader follows Konrad's degrading thoughts set in, the jumble grew to be quite understandable, and an enjoyable flow asserted itself. Mr. Haley also managed to present a sound logic as to why Night Haunter came to be the dominant aspect of the Primarch. Why, even without the Chaos Gods' subtle pressing down on the scales of his mind, he would always consider the worst of his visions to be the true line of time. Now, this is probably going to sound like the biggest possible cope a Night Lords fan can say, but after reading this story I am genuinely convinced it is the truth. It was Nostramo's fault. Because it deprived Konrad of the one thing, the one singular thing that every other Primarch had, as far as we know, besides him. The opportunity and time to be human. Think about it. Even the many of them that were initially feral children eventually got adopted by some kind of people. Yes, including Angron. To the slavers of Nuceria he was a product, to the crowds at the pits he was a spectacle, but to the gladiators he lived among he was a man. All of the Primarchs, discounting the mystery twins of the 20th, as both of their origins are mired in secrecy, were at some point just men. Great men, most definitely, in comparison to the people they grew up with, but still men. All except Konrad. From the moment his gestation pod left the Emperor's laboratories, he was nothing but alone, left only with the innate craving for justice implanted by his father, and the excruciating visions cursed upon him by the ruinous powers, to forever war in his mind. He had no one to teach him proper right from wrong, how to temper justice with mercy, how to be human. Before you point to him being reunited with the Emperor, his sons, and the other Primarchs, that still fails this test, because he wasn't human among them. He was a Primarch, a son of the Master of Mankind. He had basically jumped from monster to figurehead on a pedestal. His brothers could have taught him how to be a man, to know what it is to have an equal you can stand by, but none of them gave him anything but disgust and dismissal. They would have thought it an insult if anyone called him an equal of his. Even though the book and overall lore correctly point out that, despite his faults, Curze achieved compliance efficiently with virtually no infrastructure damage and at a fraction of the lives lost compared to all of them, his methods were simply too icky for the high and mighty to approach and try to uplift their clearly unwell brother. For figures that were built by standing in the way of adversity, it is hilarious how all of them preferred to take the easy route of just condemning him and being done with it. Because even if they tried, it would have been an uphill battle against what Nostramo had done to him. The closest Konrad ever came to becoming a human was that boy with the twin futures. If he had chosen to save him, teach him, and through him learn humanity, how to want to uphold justice for the sake of the people rather than simply for justice's sake, I believe without any doubt that he would have remained loyal, becoming someone who would wield fear as effectively as he did, but in a way that would not sour his relationships with his brothers. Yet he refused to risk the possibility of the other future. One could wonder if that was a moment where the influence of chaos pressed its thumb on the scale of his mind. But I think it was a decision born of what he had been nurtured into. His nature was to crave justice. His perception, expression, way of thinking, of managing his emotions, all of the things one learns from those around him, however, were shaped by the denizens of the night world. Those that stalked its streets, and those whose personalities he had absorbed upon devouring them, not from the pursuit of his programming, but out of the need for simple survival, as there were no other food sources for him, all of whom were either the absolute worst humanity could sink to, or the most broken humanity could be. He had drank the blood of the monster that was Nostramo, so it is no surprise that he himself turned into a monster. The sheer quantity of negative human traits infested his very being, from which I think he grew to be so pessimistic that he could simply not imagine a possibility of a positive future, hence his belief that the worst outcomes of his visions were always the true ones, quote-unquote, leading to him developing the same corruption that ran through the planet and eventually ruined his legion. Frankly, I don't think any of the Primarchs would have ended up better if the same happened to them. And by that I don't mean landing on Nostramo. Consider these. If he was the sole occupant of a gladiatorial pit's dungeons, isolated from any but his guards, would Angron not have simply grown into a hateful butcher that saw human things as nothing but loud, annoying buzzards in the stands, and mere food when it came to those loosed upon him in the arena, not even needing the nails to be forced upon him? Would the lion, Russ, and Sanguinius not have simply become beasts of the wilds they landed in had humans not adopted them? Or worse, if they were hunted by them? If they only ever encountered absolute scum, whose mentality they absorbed by devouring them either in self-defense or out of necessity? Since all of the noble and inspiring traits universal to the Primarchs were only brought to the fore, nurtured and harnessed thanks to the actual people around them. Traits that Curze himself has, as in the book on multiple occasions, even when he is on the verge of torture murdering someone, through the fear, the stench of horror upon him, people still see him as perfect, awe-inspiring, alluring even. And instead of running away when presented with the chance, they opt to stick by him to their own detriment. I wonder, dear viewer, can you not see the same? Or is this all just me kind of losing it from the seething and venting at a totally not flesh-made sculpture? Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter, is a difficult title for me to swallow. If I were to divorce myself from my biases on the matter and look upon it in a purely objective fashion, there is nothing wrong with the book. In fact, I would say it is a fairly delightful read for fans of drama and horror, albeit less for the latter, since it is, ironically enough, more of a secondary feature than the former. End of the day, though, I cannot in good conscience stoop beside the pitiful creature that met its end within its pages. Instead, I choose to rise past it by giving this Primarch novel the rat's seal of approval. Mr. Haley has produced an excellent piece of literature that was never dull to read, enthralling from cover to cover, and it would be neither just or fair for me to tarnish that just because I disagree with the trajectory its contents charted. But what about yourselves? I suspect that the opinion shared in this video can be considered as somewhat controversial, so I'm very curious to learn your thoughts when you read, or if you have already read the book for yourself. Do you agree with the sentiment I presented, or would you say I am huffing copium? Is the old interpretation of the lore more to your preference, or do you find this new development to be superior? As my assassin, I will look forward to your comments. Until our next meeting, I hope this delve into the shadow of the Night Haunter was to your delight and wish you a lovely rest of your day. Do wiždane.